Good morning, everybody. Happy Sunday. I'm here to introduce the first presenter today, David Moody. And I think one very interesting fact about David is that he was the first teacher hired at the Oak Grove School in 1975. He's employee number one. And from 1975 to 1987, he was the director of the school, this school, working with Krishnamurti every day he was here. Every day Krishnamurti was here. He's also written 3 books you may be familiar with. One about the collaborational relationship between David Bohm and Krishnamurti called An Uncommon Collaboration. One about the origin of the Oak Grove School entitled An Unconditioned Mind. And his most recent one, Krishnamurti in America, which I will read the blurb on just in case I missed something in my own description. New Perspectives on the Man and His Message. This biography examines the whole of Krishnamurti's life and work with special attention to the crucial events in the United States that have been neglected or overlooked by previous biographers. These events include the unusual and challenging circumstances leading to the formation of the Krishnamurti Foundation of America. And if you know what that's about, your interest is piqued. So, and today his talk is going to be entitled Thought and Observation, again, continuing with that thread we've been working with all weekend. So please welcome David Moody.
Okay, well, thank you, John, very much. If you'll forgive me, I need to correct very slightly one thing. We can't overlook the incredible contribution to the beginning of the school of Mark Lee, who was technically the first employee and definitely the first director for the first 8 or 10 years of the school. So we all stand in debt to his contribution. Anyway, it's really lovely to see so many people here in person this morning, and I'm told there are hundreds more who are tuning in online. And before we go any further, I think I need to offer special thanks to Francisco and Maxie and all the many other people who made this event possible. You probably don't realize just how much preparation and planning goes into creating the gathering. If I'm not mistaken, they started in early March, and it really it takes a ton of work to make it all come together. So many thanks to everyone who contributed to this. And I can't help but point out that it is now fully 40 years since Krishnamurti left us. 40 years plus 2.5 months to be exact. And I think it's awesome that there are so many people still vitally interested in the amazing legacy that he left us. So this morning we're going to talk over some topics that go right to the heart, right to the core of Krishnamurti's teaching or philosophy. But whenever we talk about Krishnamurti's work, I think we need to bear in mind that his concern was always with the whole of life, with all of humanity and human consciousness. And although he examined many, many particular topics in great detail, it was always within this much larger context. And so in a similar way, I'm going to try to place our particular topics within the framework of the teaching, which embraces the whole of life. So let's look at a couple of quotations that express this point of view. And because the theme of this year's gathering is education, I've taken most of my quotes today from a truly wonderful book called Krishnamurti's Letters to His Schools. And so this first quotation is taken from letter number 43. He writes, "One feels it is important to understand first that life is the woman, the man, the child, the animals, the river, the sky, and the forest, all of it. Not the idea of it, but to see the immensity and beauty of it. So let us realize that the movement of the skies, the earth, human existence is indivisible, and only then come to the particular." And in somewhat the same vein, from letter number 8, we are saying very definitely and most emphatically that it is only having a sense of total responsibility for all mankind, which is love, that can basically transform the present state of society. I like that phrase, very definitely and most emphatically. That doesn't leave a lot of wiggle room there, does he? So our primary topics of discussion this morning will be the nature of thought, or the thinking process, and how thought is related to observation. And these topics are central to Krishnamurti's philosophy, but they cannot be understood in isolation from their context. So our larger concern is not with any special group of people or any set of ideas or one part of the world. Our concern is with Homo sapiens, the entire species of mankind. We are saying there is disorder in the species as a whole. So let's begin with one of Krishnamurti's most characteristic fundamental principles, which is his statement that you are the world. Let's consider what he means by this and not simply take it for granted, but examine the statement and see for ourselves whether or not it is true. Evidently, there is a literal sense in which you are not the world. After all, the world consists of billions of people spread out over the entire planet. If you and I were suddenly to cease to exist, those billions would still continue right on. So what sense does it make to say you are the world? Well, Krishnamurti is speaking psychologically, not physically. From a purely physical standpoint, you are not the world. But what about psychologically? Is it reasonable to say that the individual is the same as everyone else? Krishnamurti writes in letter number 6, a human being psychologically is the whole of mankind. He not only represents it, but he is the whole of the human species. If you observe closely, you will find that just as you suffer, so does all mankind suffer in various degrees. Agony, jealousy, envy, and fear are known to all. So when Krishnamurti says you are the world, he's speaking psychologically. And it's not just some kind of a hope or a wish. He's not describing an ideal state of mind or a point of view that he would like us to adopt. Instead, he's expressing what he considers to be an actual, observable fact, something as real and concrete as the ground we stand on. And so this raises the question, why don't most of us see this fact? What is preventing us from seeing it with our own eyes? Now, this brings us to our primary topic for this morning, which is the process of thinking, because it is thought which is blocking us from recognizing our similarity to one another. Our images of ourselves are what create our differences, our separation and exclusion. Maybe you are a Christian and maybe I'm something else. We are attached to these concepts and labels, which are a form of thought. And so the concept becomes more important than the elements of life that we actually have in common. Now, Krishnamurti says that the tendency to fragment things, to divide everything up into separate pieces, is an inherent characteristic of thought. The very nature of the thinking process is to establish boundaries, definitions, categories. And when we apply that process to human beings, we see or create the plethora of different kinds of people, religious groups, national groups, racial or ethnic groups, groups based on language, socioeconomic groups, and on it goes. No wonder it may sound strange at first to consider that you are the world. So Krishnamurti made it one of the central features of his teaching to examine closely what thought consists of and how it functions in daily life and what are its consequences. I don't know of any other individual in all of history who has given so much sustained attention to the nature of thought and discovered so many of its basic principles. So let's review what some of those principles are. We've already mentioned Krishnamurti's insight that thought creates parts, divisions, fragments, instead of seeing the totality of something. But perhaps this characteristic is a byproduct of something even more basic. He often declares that thought is the response of memory. He writes in letter 31, intellect is generally considered different from emotion, but we use the word intellect to convey the whole human capacity for thought. Thought is the response of memory, accumulated through various experiences, which are stored as knowledge in the brain. Now, this is equivalent to saying that thought represents the past. Thought is the vehicle we have that enables us to access the past with words, pictures, concepts, images, and ideas. I sometimes wonder if the past can only come to us in fragmentary fashion. Perhaps that's the price we pay for our ability to have access to that which has come and gone. By opening the door to the past, thought creates the entire framework of time, the movement of events from the past to the present and into the future. And so if there are any problems inherent in that framework, they too have their source in the thinking process. And we will discuss this point later in much greater detail. Another form of the past is what we call knowledge. So knowledge and thought are basically equivalent. He writes in letter 65, the exercise of the brain is confined to the field of knowledge, the known. The known is the past, and from that, the future or the present is built. However intricate and subtle knowledge is, it is always within the field of time, the known, and thought has its roots in the past. Now, Krishnamurti often makes the point that the entire field of knowledge is limited. We might ask what he means by this or why he considers it to be so important. I think he's challenging one of our implicit assumptions, which is that, in principle, knowledge can do anything. It can solve any problem. But if knowledge is always limited, then it must be incomplete. It tells only part of whatever story it represents. Just as a map shows only an abstraction or an outline of the territory, so too knowledge describes only part of reality. It tells us a lot, but it also leaves a lot out. So perfect knowledge is never possible, and partial knowledge, which is all we ever have, leads to serious problems in the psychological field. In letter 45, Krishnamurti wrote, "We must first realize that knowledge is always limited, as are all experiences. This employment of knowledge, with its limitations, can be very destructive. In relationships, knowledge cultivates the image of the other person and obscures the reality of that person and of that relationship." In letter number 5, he writes, "Knowledge will not lead to intelligence. We know we should not kill another. This knowing is totally unrelated to the fact of killing. Knowledge does not prevent our killing animals and destroying the earth." And finally comes the issue of how thought regards itself. We can see that thought is built upon assumptions, and some of these have to do with what it believes to be the case about itself. And the primary assumption thought makes is that it has its source in a psychological entity outside of itself, one that produces thought, the thinker. According to Krishnamurti, the image of a thinker as an independent reality represents one of our deepest illusions and the source of tremendous confusion and conflict. Krishnamurti maintains that thought is a mechanical process produced by the brain. He says the qualities or characteristics that we attribute to a thinker are actually characteristics of the thinking process. So thought itself has all the qualities of the thinker, or as he puts it, the thinker is the thought. And once the image of the thinker is established in consciousness, which must occur at a very early age, he or she soon begins to wear other hats. He becomes the observer, the one who sees and understands. He's the controller, attempting to manage our feelings and desires. Ultimately, the thinker merges with our very identity, the center of our psychological life. He or she is the self, the ego, the one we call me. So these principles describe some of the characteristics of thought as it functions in daily life. Krishnamurti says that thought is the past, it is fragmentation, it is time, it is knowledge, and thought is deeply confused about itself. Now, Krishnamurti is always careful to acknowledge the achievements of thought and knowledge. He has no quarrel with science or with practical applications and technological achievements, whether in medicine or engineering or astrophysics. His concern is rather with the way thought interferes, not only in outward relationships, but also inwardly, in the psychological dynamics within each one of us. So his assessment is balanced with a clear recognition of the accomplishments of thought, coupled with an examination of its highly dysfunctional effects. I think we can gain some perspective on the magnitude of what Krishnamurti is proposing if we look at it from the point of view of biological evolution, because the process of thinking is a uniquely human characteristic, Other species don't share this ability, except perhaps in a very rudimentary form. And there must have been a time in the evolution of man before thought became so firmly established. Now, thought does not leave any mark or evidence in the form of fossils or other objects or artifacts, so we cannot know exactly when it developed or over what stretch of time, but I think we can make a rough approximation. If we consider the timeline of human evolution, several landmarks stand out as highly significant. Of all the physical characteristics that define humanity, biologists consider that walking upright on 2 feet is perhaps the most important. That is called bipedalism, and the evidence indicates that it first occurred about 5 or 6 million years ago. But there's nothing about bipedalism that suggests any ability to use the process of thought. And so it was not until about 2 million years ago that there was any sign that early humans were able to engage in some form of thinking. That is when people first began to create primitive tools made of stone. Now, these tools were simply rocks that had been struck by another rock in order to produce a sharp edge or a flat surface. And this is the first evidence that early man was engaged in purposeful planning behavior, which is one indication of the possible beginning of thought. But the full development of the thinking process requires much more than that. Above all, it requires language or speech, which must have evolved only gradually over hundreds of thousands of years. One of the signs that humans were evolving the ability to speak is a small bone that we have in our throat called the hyoid bone. Now, speech requires the ability to control the muscles of the throat and the passage of air with very fine precision. And the hyoid bone is a crucial piece of equipment to make that happen. And the fossil record has found the first modern hyoid bone dated to about 400,000 years ago. So some form of language was probably present by that time. And with language comes the capacity for the full development of thought. Now, there have been several species that biologists consider to be essentially human, such as the Neanderthals. But Homo sapiens represents what we call fully modern man. And our species has been present for about 200,000 years. The brain had grown to its present size by that time, and since the hyoid bone was in its proper place, we must have always had the capacity for speech. And so it seems reasonable to assume that the thinking process was also well established. So thought has a lineage that seems to coincide with the advent of our species, if not somewhat earlier. We might even make the case that thought is the hallmark of Homo sapiens, our most notable characteristics. So this tells us something about the magnitude and depth of what Krishnamurti has proposed. He is questioning the very foundation of our characteristics as a species. He says we have never really examined the nature of the thinking process that defines us. And that, he says, is why we live in conflict and disorder. From letter 14, he writes, "We have never questioned the very nature of thought. We have accepted thought as inevitable as our eyes and legs. We've never probed to the very depth of thought, and because we have never questioned it, it has assumed preeminence. It is the tyrant of our life, and tyrants are rarely challenged." And in letter 61, he wrote, As human beings, every one of us has to think, act, and live in a totally different way. This revolution is not in the social or the economic field, but at a much greater depth. It is in the very structure of human consciousness. So, looking at the development of thought in an evolutionary context is one way to gain some perspective on it. Another way to help understand it is to consider what part of our psychology is not based upon thought. We have said that our individual identity arises from the thinking process, and our past and our future have their roots there as well. So what part of life, if any, is free from this process? And this question brings us to our second topic for this morning, which is the capacity for observation. Just to perceive, to be aware with the eyes and ears and other senses, and also inwardly, that is the instrument we have that is not part of thought. So thought and observation go together in a sense. They form a pair because there are two different modes or mediums by means of which we have access to the world. And this raises the question whether they run along entirely separate tracks or whether they affect one another or are interrelated. And that brings us to some other basic principles of Krishnamurti's philosophy. He writes in letter number 11, "Ideas are abstractions from what is, and any idea or conclusion about what is actually happening distorts what is happening. Knowledge is not the fact. It is about the fact, and that has its proper place. But knowledge prevents perception of what actually is." And so thought and observation need to be studied in combination because they interact with one another. The quintessential case of this kind, one that Krishnamurti returns to over and over again, occurs when we see a flower or a tree and immediately identify it by its name. The very act of calling a flower an orchid or a tree a eucalyptus is a form of interference with observation. The name serves as a screen between the observing individual and whatever he or she is looking at. And in that simple example, we can see all the elements that create disorder in relationship. We often look at another person through the image or label that we have about them, and they often look at us in the same way. We each contribute to a division that leads to conflict. He writes in letter 67, "There is no relationship if you have an image about yourself or about another. That image may be based on your knowledge, your experience, and these images separate you from another. Where there is separation of any kind, there must be conflict in yourself, and so with the world." Now, a very similar dynamic takes place within ourselves. Krishnamurti cautions against naming a feeling when it occurs, such as envy or anger or greed. Merely to name the feeling imposes a framework from the past, a set of associations in which all kinds of values are contained. The actual feeling of envy is one thing, but to name it, to say this is envy, contains a subtle condemnation, for society has embedded that concept with a negative judgment, with a connotation of something similar to sin. And so the machinery of the word, with its associations, interferes with our perception of the feeling itself. When we name that feeling as envy, we are implicitly rejecting it, suppressing it, or wanting to eradicate it altogether. So now we are in conflict with ourselves. So inward conflict is one consequence of naming and judging feelings as they arise. In addition, the act of naming is part of the process that generates the assumption of a thinker. And now we are in deep waters. By having the concept of a psychological entity who stands apart from thoughts and feelings, we've actually altered the structure of consciousness. Now our state of mind is no longer whole. It is divided at its core, at its root. For the brain perceives the image of the thinker as an independent reality, as an entity that exists by itself. And around that illusion, our whole psychological life revolves. Krishnamurti often pointed out that where there is division, there must be conflict. He sometimes calls this a law, and since he discovered it and expressed it, I like to call it Krishnamurti's law. Where there is division, there must be conflict. And by this principle, the consequence of having our consciousness divided is to engender conflict throughout our being. So now conflict is woven into the fabric of daily life. It becomes something so familiar that we hardly notice it, or we simply assume that it is part of the natural order. But that is not the end of the story. There's another whole chapter to the manner in which thought generates illusion and conflict. As we pointed out a little earlier, thought is the response of memory, and so it represents the past. We might even say, as Krishnamurti sometimes does, thought is the past. And the past creates a kind of avenue or bridge through the present into the future. We don't really know what the future holds, but we can always make projections of what it might be. These predictions generally consist of various images from the past, but modified by whatever is happening now, including our hopes and fears. So now we have a timeline of events extending from the distant past through the recent past into the present and projected into the future. Now, some of these events may be factual in the sense of representing things which actually did occur. And some of the predictions of the future may be accurate, especially if they are confined to physical issues. The movements inside an atom can be predicted with great precision, and the trains might run on time. So we call this chronological time or physical time. And this is an area where thought has done us a great service. This kind of time helps coordinate our actions and understand what causes lead to what effects. The trouble arises when we insert an illusory agent, an imaginary actor, into this sequence of events. This actor, of course, is ourselves, the psychological entity that we call me. Now, we don't notice that to insert this actor into the framework of time is a false move, but it fundamentally changes the meaning and character of time. Now time is no longer tracking just the predictable motions of the physical world. Instead, chronological time has been co-opted, in a sense, to serve the needs of an entity that is illusory in itself. This mixture of the psychological self with chronological time has very fateful consequences. It creates what Krishnamurti calls psychological time. And now that field forms the framework or structure of our lives. Once we have psychological time, we have a space within which to imagine ourselves becoming something more or better than what we are now. In the future, I will become clear. I will understand. tomorrow I will get over my fear. Sooner or later, I will be somebody. In this way, the movement through psychological time becomes the guiding principle of our lives. The trouble with this scenario is that psychological time does not really exist. It's an imaginary construction that has no independent reality outside of the images in our minds. Chronological time is objective in the sense that we can all see the events that it describes. But psychological time is a private phenomenon. It consists of images that are the subjective property of each of us as individuals. The illusion is to think that these images correspond to or are part of chronological time. We don't see that they're just an extension of our thinking process. Krishnamurti calls the life that we lead in psychological time the process of becoming. He considers it one of the primary sources of conflict and confusion. It generates a chronic contradiction between what we are now and what we think we should become. In addition, under the guise of helping us achieve whatever it is that we desire, thought, in fact, blocks us from the real engine of psychological change, because there is a way to find clarity. There is a way to live without conflict, but that way is very different than the process of becoming through psychological time. Now, this is something we have to examine carefully because it is central to Krishnamurti's philosophy. So let's look at how we normally try to bring about change within ourselves. First, we have some kind of image of what we want to be or become. That image becomes our goal. It is what should be in Krishnamurti's terms. In addition to the image of our future self, we have the motivation to achieve that image. What follows next is an act of will. We form the intention to act in the way that we hope will achieve that goal. So we have the image of the future and the motivation to achieve it and the deliberate intention to act. All of this process, according to Krishnamurti, is futile, a wastage of energy. It actually impedes the only genuine, meaningful form of change, because the psychological world doesn't behave in the same way as the physical world. In order to build a bridge, for example, we do need a blueprint of the finished structure, as well as a sequence of steps to construct it. But inward change doesn't come about in the same way. It follows a different dynamic. According to Krishnamurti, inward change is inherent in the very act of observation. To see something new precipitates change in and of itself. This is one of his most fundamental insights. And so I'm going to illustrate this point with a few quotations so you can see how he expresses it in different ways. From letter number 12, he writes, "It is the fact that is to be observed, not the consequence of the fact, or how the fact has come into being, but to observe the fact with all its reactions. This then transforms the fact." It is important to understand this very deeply, not to act upon the fact, but to observe what is. From letter 53, "When we say we understand, it generally means an intellectual or verbal comprehension, but comprehending is to perceive sensitively that which is, and that very perception is the withering away of that which is." From letter 30, "Perception is attention. That attention throws light with all its energy on that which is being observed. This light of perception brings about a transformation of the thing observed. Now, the corollary of this principle is equally important. The corollary is anything that interferes with observation is therefore an impediment to change. And what interferes with observation is the very thinking process that wants to bring about change. From letter 24, the word prevents the actual perception of the thing or person because the word has many associations. These associations distort not only visual but also psychological observation. Words then become a barrier to the free flow of observation. And later in the same letter he writes, desire sustained by thought, creating the image, is very strong. The image is the word, is the picture, and this follows our pleasure, our desire. So the whole way of our life is shaped by the word and its associations. To see this entire process is to see the truth of how thought prevents perception. So we began our talk today by pointing out that any particular topic, such as thought or observation, cannot be understood unless we see it within the overall context of Krishnamurti's teaching. And that context entails a deep concern with the whole of humanity and a recognition that our species is dysfunctional in some very significant ways. And so his philosophy provides a diagnosis of that dysfunction as well as a remedy for it. To put it most succinctly, I think we could say that the essence of his teaching is psychological transformation for the individual and for the world. So before we conclude our examination of thought and observation, we should consider how they are related to the overarching issue of transformation. Now, in order to address this question, I think it will help to bring in a few statements Krishnamurti has made about psychological change. I think I neglected to show you the previous slide. There it is. Sorry. So now, catching up to where we are now, Krishnamurti has said many times, the first step is the last step. Now, at first glance, that statement makes it sound like change might not be too difficult. Only one step. But I think we have to be careful here because that first step might be enormous. And in any case, if there is only one step, then we certainly need to get clear about exactly what that is. Another statement Krishnamurti has made is, there is no self to understand, but only the thought that creates the self. Now, the general objective of self-understanding is fairly widespread in our culture, especially in therapeutic circles and some spiritual traditions. It is considered one of the keys to psychological change. So, in saying that there is no self to understand, Krishnamurti is drawing a sharp distinction between his point of view and the conventional interpretation of change. Finally, I would like to bring in Krishnamurti's statement that change is the denial of change. Now, this might seem self-contradictory at first, or perhaps mystical or paradoxical, But I think he means something very specific and concrete, something that takes all the mystery out of it. And if we put this statement together with the previous two, I think we will have the material we need to understand the relationship between thought and observation and psychological transformation. So what does Krishnamurti have in mind when he says the first step is the last step? Well, evidently he was referring to what he calls self-knowledge or choiceless awareness. This process entails an observation of oneself from moment to moment, including not only your actions and behavior, but also the thoughts and feelings that represent the content of consciousness. He calls it choiceless because it's an observation without any evaluation of what you observe. But it's not a method intended to achieve a result. Self-knowledge is not an action performed at the direction of thought. And so it represents a simple but very subtle and perhaps elusive state of mind. Incidentally, we should note that self-knowledge is not part of what he means by knowledge in general. What he calls self-knowledge doesn't accumulate in memory. It consists of a moment-to-moment perception. I think we could call it self-awareness in order to avoid any confusion with ordinary knowledge. Now, this kind of observation leads inevitably to awareness of the center, of the self or ego. But if that self is merely a product of thought, as Krishnamurti maintains, then it makes no sense to think of transformation in terms of changing it. An entity that does not really exist cannot very well implement change of any kind, least of all change in its own non-existent being. Instead, it is the process of thinking that requires attention and understanding. Now, the examination of the thinking process leads in turn to psychological time. Trying to become something more or better is what Krishnamurti is questioning, challenging, when he says that change is the denial of change. He is saying, if you stop attempting to improve yourself through psychological time, which is to deny change, that in itself will represent a far more fundamental form of change. The reason it is so important to deny change in the conventional sense is because then we can remain with what is. We can face whatever is happening now. This is the key point, according to Krishnamurti. The total perception of what is happening now, thoughts, feelings, motivations, fear, desire, is what enables or precipitates actual change. Whereas psychological time is the avenue of escape from what is happening now. And so, ironically, it is the greatest impediment to transformation. This is what Krishnamurti calls the negative approach. Our human predicament does not require some new kind of action, but rather the ending of certain old actions. The denial of change in the conventional sense is part of the deep change that is needed. But the machinery of psychological time is thoroughly embedded in our thinking process. So to deny it is not just a decision you can make. It can only come about through careful observation and radical insight. So this completes our review of thought and observation and what role they play in the world and within ourselves. We said that Krishnamurti's teaching is always framed within the context of humanity as a whole, and what he says has to be seen in that context. And what we see is that thought has divided our species into innumerable camps or tribes, separating people by language, geography, by skin color, beliefs, and on and on. And so Krishnamurti says, you are the world. Those differences among people are insignificant. What we have in common is far deeper and makes us all fundamentally alike. So thought superimposes a false structure onto the basic reality of mankind. What people have in common are moments of beauty and joy and sometimes deep affection, coupled with fear, loneliness, conflict, and sorrow. That is the common lot of most of us and what we spend our lives wrestling with or trying to overcome. What we neglect or fail to do is to observe, to examine, to see for ourselves what is the actual source of our difficulties. But if we do examine it, we will see that the thinking process is implicated in all of our feelings and actions. And so if there's any illusion embedded in our thought, it will have far-reaching consequences. And that is what we do find if we observe closely. When we see a flower and immediately recall its name, we feel we are adding something to the experience of seeing the flower. But Krishnamurti points out that instead we have imposed a screen between the flower and ourselves, which prevents us from seeing it fully. Inwardly, we also impose a screen between ourselves and our feelings by naming and evaluating them, and in the process, making ourselves into a separate psychological entity. But that entity is fictitious in the sense that it is only a picture or concept or image that does not correspond to anything real. But thought invests that picture with a sense of actuality, as if it had an independent existence, and our brain accepts that interpretation. And so is born the thinker, who then becomes the observer, the judge, the controller, and the center of our lives. In this way, thought introduces a division in consciousness. And where there is division, there must be conflict. So thought creates conflict both in the world at large, as well as within the structure of consciousness that we each share with one another. So let's make a quick summary of what Krishnamurti discovered about the thinking process and how it functions in daily life. He said, thought is the past, thought is the response of memory, thought is knowledge, and thought is always limited. He said, thought is fragmentary, thought is divisive. The thinker is the thought, and thought is psychological time. Now, these insights and the implications that follow from them represent a comprehensive revolution in consciousness and relationship. But the history of humanity is actually one of repeated revolutions in our understanding. Consider the time when everyone believed that the sun and stars all rotated around the earth, which stood at the center of the universe. It took centuries, including the trial of Galileo, to overcome that entrenched idea. Or consider the time before Darwin, when plants and animals and all of nature could only have been the work of God. But biological evolution never really made sense until geologists discovered the incredible age of the Earth, some 4 billion years. That is called deep time, And only with that background was it possible to envision the slow evolution of the first cells, then plants and insects and animals, and finally us. It required the understanding of all that to overturn the idea that nature was the handiwork of God. So human understanding has undergone profound changes before, and the day may come, I'm tempted to say the day will come, when Krishnamurti's insights will be more widely acknowledged, appreciated, and enter into the lives of many people. His work is too deep and too original to attract so far the attention it deserves. But it lives on, in spite of the odds, in his schools, as well as in the many books and talks and dialogues. Now, before we conclude, I'd like to draw your attention to one of the underappreciated parts of the literature Krishnamurti has left us, which are his many exquisite descriptions of scenes from nature. There are literally hundreds of these scattered throughout his written work. Most of the interviews in the 3 volumes of commentaries on living are preceded by one of these vivid vignettes, 1 or 2 pages each. And many more can be found in his 3 diaries, his notebook, his journal, and Krishnamurti to himself. Krishnamurti doesn't explain why he includes these descriptions of something he has observed. Screeching parrots, or a single leaf, or a vast river. But I think the reason is implicit. He is showing, by way of demonstration, the background of nature against which the story of mankind is taking place. He's reminding us of the magnificent world that exists entirely without benefit of thought. The next quotation occupies 2 slides from letter 54. He wrote, "Nature is not put together by thought, as religion is, as belief is. Nature is the tiger, that extraordinary animal with its energy, its great sense of power. Nature is the solitary tree in the field. It is that squirrel shyly hiding behind a bough. One must have a feeling for all this, not kill for one's pleasure, not kill animals for food. We grew out of the seed, the earth, and we are part of all that. But we are rapidly losing the sense that we are animals like the others." And from letter 70, "When you look around you, not so much in the human world as in nature, in the heavens, you see an extraordinary sense of order, balance, and harmony. Every tree and flower has its own order, its own beauty. It is only man that lives in confusion, in conflict, in disorder." And finally, I'd also like to recommend Krishnamurti's letters to his schools, which was the source for most of the quotations we looked at today. The first edition of this book came out in 1981 and contained the first 37 letters. And it was not until the 2000s that the expanded version came out, including all 72 letters. This version is much easier to read, and each letter is given a title and a number, and those are the numbers I use to identify the quotations in this talk. Now, you might assume that these letters, 3 or 4 pages each, would represent only a narrow slice of Krishnamurti's philosophy, but that is not the case. As you can see in our quotations from the letters today, the as you can see in our quotations today, the letters contain many threads from throughout the tapestry of the teachings. And they answer for all time that crucial question: how can teachers actually carry out the deep intention of his schools, which is to change the consciousness of the world? From letter number 11, the schools exist primarily to bring about a profound transformation in human beings. The educator is wholly responsible for this. The teachers in these schools should really understand this, not intellectually, but because they see the full implications of this with their whole being. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we're going to have a panel and question and answer session now. Corey, I'm not sure. Are you looking at questions that are being submitted by the audience? I kind of had that feeling. I've been down this path before, and I kind of see the. Fire away.
Let me start with
Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure if we were beginning.
Oh,
yeah,
okay. I don't know either.
So my name's Corey, and I'm here. I have some people online have been watching and submitting some questions, so maybe we can start with one of these to kick it off.
Sure, good.
This questioner asks, as someone who speaks on K, can you comment on your experience of working with versus interpreting the teachings?
Okay, that's that's a long question. I wrote my first book, The Unconditioned Mind, was my effort to put down on paper all of the significant interactions I had with Krishnamurti and everything that significant that I saw him do during the first 10 years of the school when he was alive. So that book answers that question much more than I ever could. I would say that what my experience of knowing him personally, it contributed a great many things, but one of them was just how perfectly normal he could be in everyday life. He was a rather shy person, and he was, infinitely aware of the attention that his presence would draw wherever he went. And he didn't like to be the center of that kind of attention. And so he was kind of shy and would kind of fade into the background if he could see any opportunity to do that. The main opportunities for daily interaction with him occurred at the lunch table. When he was in Ojai for 3 months every year, he would come down to the lunch table where there would be 10 or 15 or 20 of us. And most of that time he would sit rather quietly. He might ask Michael Cronin, who was the chef, "What is the news, sir?" And they would talk about the news of the day a little bit. Occasionally, after the meal was finished, he would get into some more interesting topics. Nothing too serious, but they might start talking about supernatural things or just topical issues that might be of general interest. My position, especially later on as director of the school, enabled me to have some private conversations with him. And those, of course, were more significant, meaningful. It'd take too long to go into those here, but they're all in that book that I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you.
Can we also say, like, rather than the personal relationship, was it asking about living versus interpreting? Or was that the question?
I
Is
can't
it
say
gone?
for sure because
It's gone.
Yeah.
Well, even if it wasn't, the subtitle of that book, right? Either the original version or the second edition, I can't remember, is "The Whole Movement of Life is Learning." And to me, the bridge between that division that we all live with.
You're talking about this book.
Yeah, so that's the subtitle.
Yeah.
The Whole Movement of Life is Learning.
I didn't want to confuse it with the other book I mentioned, which I wrote about.
No, this is the one you quoted from here.
But it's not the one that I mentioned to Corey regarding the book that described my experiences of the school.
No, that's the Unconditioned Mind.
Yeah.
So, first of all, when I was listening to that, I thought, how ironic it is that God created the world so divisive, and that division is the problem. I mean, what did he expect or she expect? But anyway, the whole movement of life is learning, and the difference between interpreting the teachings or living a life that's factual or true, for my worth is in that word learning and understanding that is a state of openness and human beingness rather than human doingness or human thinking. And that is what makes all the difference. And then that word, that question of interpretation, or are you just quoting, are you coming from the known, sort of can not be such a burden, which it is for all of, in a lot of our dialogues. Are you speaking from the known? But what about the authority and this and that and the other thing? In the process of learning, that is all part of the wash. It's not the obstacle. It's part of the learning. It all kind of devolves into learning, or dissolves into learning, not evolves. Anyway, okay, that's enough.
Yeah, I appreciated your presentation, and one element of it that piqued my interest that I thought might be interesting to ask you about was you mentioned the implicit assessment that can be sort of latent in the words that we use for our experiences. So jealousy is a word about an experience I may be having that has implicit judgment, carries implicit judgment about the experience.
Very strong.
And I wonder if we could just look at that and use that as an example to see, like, what is the relationship with that implicit assessment and this deep process of becoming something? Like, is the process of, I am this right now, but I want to be something else. So I am jealous, but I don't want to be jealous.
Yeah.
Is it that desire to be something different that is the basis for this implicit assessment, or does the assessment come before? Does my question make sense? It's very subtle. Like it's so it felt like that was a good place to zoom in because it shows just how deep this bias towards either moving towards or moving away from any kind of experience I'm having. It's embedded in the language we use to even describe our experience to ourselves. So I just wondered if there was anything else you could speak to regarding this like implicit assessment in our descriptions of our experience and this process of becoming that you mentioned.
I can't think of anything. I think we've kind of covered it. It's a very, very common thing, and we have an implicit assumption that in moving away from my jealousy, I'm accomplishing something important and worthwhile. That's another one of the implicit assumptions in that whole process. And so to observe both the jealousy and the movement away from it, I think is what Kay is pointing towards. You got to see the whole package. And see how the movement away is blocking you. We think the movement away is what's going to save us. It's not. It's what blocks us from, transcending that feeling.
You could say the movement away from jealousy is what we know more of jealousy than the whatever it is that we're trying to move away from.
Absolutely.
If we see that, isn't the moving away from jealousy sustaining the jealousy?
Feels like
Ironically,
possibly.
I'm making the distinction here between seeing, you said not moving away and not moving towards. In that case, what is seen and what is experienced? Or those two words are distinctive. When you see jealousy, what you may or may not see is the movement of thought with a certain color to it. When you experience jealousy, you have this emotion that goes, God, this is awful. And as I've experienced it, when you see it, you see like two rivers flowing, and one is jealousy and one is sort of that which is seeing. And you have to make a choice to go back to jealousy. You don't have to make a choice to stay in the seeing. And a lot of times we'll make the choice because, well, let me give it a little more time with jealousy because I really want that thing I'm jealous about. But it's all there in that seeing, and it's done. But we can make a choice to recreate it. Throw that out there.
Are people sending in questions from online?
Yeah.
Is that where you're getting these from?
And then 10 minutes
and we
we'll
also
have them
can invite
ask questions if
members
they
from
like.
the audience.
Oh, okay.
There's a microphone in the middle of the aisle, so if you have a question, feel free to come to the microphone.
Because we're supposed to wrap up at 10:12, right?
In the meantime, I have one other question I can ask from the online audience. And they're asking if you could say any more about the implications of what you shared on thought and observation for education specifically.
Yeah, this is a tough one because, you're dealing with issues that, we're talking about education. The Oak Grove School runs from pre-elementary through 12th grade. What age kids are you talking about? These issues have got to be age adjusted, and how you approach these issues depends very much on who exactly you're talking to and what is the developmental level that you're dealing with. So that's one factor. Another factor is, especially working with kids, you have to make it concrete. You can't talk about these things, or you can, but you can't very well talk about these things in the abstract. The thing is to be aware yourself as a teacher of these issues and see it arising in concrete situations and bring it out in the concrete and the actuality in terms that the kids can make sense of, because it's actual, it's part of their lives.
Can I ask you a question?
No.
When we use the phrase "you are the world," right? And it's very clear how you used it in the psychological sense. We all have the sense of division, and that division creates conflict and the suffering that is individual but shared. But do you feel that there's another aspect to that statement that because otherwise, and Krishnamurti said that emphatic statement about being responsible for the whole of humankind,
Very definitely.
like, I'm not responsible for your bad behavior. He's not saying that, but why are we responsible? In other words, is there another aspect of connectivity rather than division that is inferred in that statement?
Yeah, he said, we are saying very definitely and most emphatically that it is only having the total responsibility which will change the present state of society. He doesn't say you have to have the sense of responsibility. He's just saying that it's only having it that will bring about that change. Is that?
Well, I'm thinking too, like in the end of that division, if sorry for that word, ends in you and in myself and in Corey and in everybody out here, and we are humans being, aren't we the world in that sense too? Aren't we the same in that sense? Rather than sharing conflict, we share beingness, is what I'm kind of getting at. There's a sort of a quote-unquote positive aspect to that statement rather than it being, you are the rest of mankind, you're all messed up, right? You share that, so wow, great, that makes me feel better. But rather, we are the world, we are all the same, apart from our names and our supposed fake identity of a self. That's what the world truly is. And what is that? And what does learning have to do with that? And using his help, our help, and that may help in not trying to get rid of jealousy, rather than understand the being of jealousy. You know, thou art that. I am jealousy, or I am the world. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Is this working?
Yes,
oh,
now.
it's working.
Yeah.
Hi. What would you recommend? And I completely understand when you just now said, depending on the age of children, teachers should be the ones embodying these teachings and principles and values to be able to recognize. Totally. So if there is maybe one or two things that you would say that are like really essential for a teacher of an early child education, so that would be babies to 3, what would that be?
Babies to 3.
So what would be, not to impart to babies and toddlers, what would be 1 or 2 or 3 things that you would want that are essential for an educator to embody or emulate during her work?
Oh dear, I'm sorry, I can't. You're talking about babies to 3 years old.
Yeah.
I really, really don't know, because, you know, even with children, conveying this kind of thing that Krishnamurti is talking about, you have to use language. You have to speak, pretty much. Maybe some of it is conveyed in behavior and quality of relationship, but I think the prerequisites are that there's some, you know, elements of an actual interaction kind of relationship. And when you're talking about a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, I don't know. I don't have much experience personally with kids that young, so.
So I'm not saying what the teacher should be imparting to the babies and toddlers. I'm saying, what would you say to the educator, to the teacher? What are some of the primary teachings or values that you would like that educator to have while working with those young children?
Yeah, I think you guys should handle that one. That's why we have a panel, because if one of us is out to lunch on the question, we have two guys who can fill in for us.
I was sitting right next to a 2 or 3 year old girl the whole time. She was running in and out, and I think there's just such an availability for affection between people that age and anyone else or anything else. I don't have a lesson plan other than somehow not encouraging bad behavior or selfishness, but encouraging just the affection, the intelligence of the affection the adult has learned, and mixing that with the affection of a child sort of transmits something without maybe language and without indulgence, like spoiledness or anything like that.
Would that be in the spirit of Krishnamurti's teachings, or you mean in general? Because I'm not talking about general, I'm talking about in the light of Krishnamurti's teachings.
Both and. I don't know, actually, to be honest with you.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Kind of what I meant by affection. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead at the microphone.
That's fine. So this is perhaps a question that I would have asked Krishnamurti himself if only I was born when he was alive. I guess I'm some 60 years late to it. But regardless, since we touched this topic today and yesterday by Patik as well, so when one is completely aware, thought stops momentarily, right? However short or brief that may be, right?
When you're completely aware, thought stops momentarily.
Right?
Oh, okay.
So in that instance, when thought stops, when you're aware, there's also this feeling that you're aware that you're being aware, right? Is that another form of thought?
Yes.
Because to me, I can clearly see the difference of thought stopping and the fact that you're being aware. That
When
you're
aware that you're aware, you're thinking.
Okay. Okay. Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, one more.
You'll be the last one, Sudeep.
Oh, thank you, David. Lovely, beautiful. It's beautiful to have a teacher read and share with us all the citations. So thank you. Really appreciate that. I'm glad Mark hired you as a first teacher. I was just thinking that you mentioned about geological record and 4 billion years almost. I'm just wondering if this is the path of progress, of evolution, of things that are good for us, like we see in the garden. when things are good are happening, you see something that comes rewarding, whether it's flowers or fruits. If this is the path of civilization in plus 4 billion years, maybe all of us who are fragmented and who are caught up in all the nonsense of life, we will wither away and we will evolve away. I'm just musing about the possibility that in the future there will be us or people that will actually be beautiful and kind and thoughtful and spontaneous, and so the joy of childhood will continue into adulthood. And so I just musing about that possibility, and so there's some thoughts. Thanks.
Well, it's a very nice dream, but I think you have to factor in that all of that joy and beauty will probably be under the control of our artificial intelligence masters. So, sorry.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's been watching. Oh yeah. So for those of us who are here, lunch is being served at the main house.